Today I'm speaking to a neurosurgeon. Yes, we got to the point on Healnlearn where I'm actually going to bring a neurosurgeon on the channel who's going to talk to us about clear facts from his experience and from his current engagement with the University of Virginia Tech, where he's teaching neuroscience. I'm welcoming Gary Simonds.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Yeah. I'm going to release this for sure before Christmas. So yeah. All right. So let's get straight to the subject, because you touched previously, before we started the conversation, on burnout and the neurological connections of how you can behaviorally change your neurology, something that a lot of people consider, especially in business, consider as a soft subject, but is actually crucial to health and well-being. So I'm going to hit you straight with a very interesting question. I am a very strong proponent of the Silva method, and I train people on the Silva method, and I practice it myself. And in one of Silva's books that I've studied extensively, he actually says that he's had cases where more than or half of the brain of a person was removed, and they still had complete cognitive and physical mobility. What is your explanation of this? Have you observed anything like this in your practice?
Yeah, I actually used to do that operation. It's in very special cases of prolonged, protracted epilepsy with seizure after seizure after seizure coming from one side of the brain. And when the seizures are doing that kind of constantly, they jump over to the other side of the brain and get the other side of the brain involved. And usually it has to deal with an injury to the brain during development in the womb. But one way or the other, one side of the brain isn't working well already and is seizing, is constantly causing seizures. And if you take that section of the brain out, including a whole hemisphere, you can stop the seizures basically on the other side. But it is kind of a specialized case because this all started even in the womb. And so one side of the brain wasn't working well right from the start. And as the brain was connecting up and putting itself together, if you will, it made a bunch of compensatory connections on the opposite side. So if you take an adult and you take half the brain out, they're not going to be as functional. They may still be cognitively very good because cognition really is represented on both sides, but there would definitely be major motor, major movement problems with that. But with these children who have had seizures right from the very beginning, they've kind of switched a bunch of their functions over to the other side anyway. Now, what is the meaning of that? It is kind of an extreme example of how the brain, even though our brains are wired very similarly, it's not static. The brain is changing, and it can change significantly if you start early enough, but it can also change right through our 80s and 90s and 100s, hopefully.
Yeah, interesting. Well, previously there was the notion or the belief that the links between our brains don't really rearrange. Now, I think it's called neuroplasticity is a fixed thing, and now there's a new field of study claiming that we can rearrange these links. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think there's very good evidence that there is at least a certain degree of neuroplasticity that goes on all the time. I mean it goes on all the time. Now, if we talk about, just like we were talking about with what we call hemispherectomies, taking out half the brain, if we're talking something major or a big stroke or a big injury to the brain, we may not be able to rewire all those functions. So there is some hardwiring in there that goes on, and it's fairly consistent from person to person. But when you drill down to the cellular level, when you get down to the actual nerve cells, they're connected all up like wires in a computer, if you will, but a very fancy computer. And so there are billions of neurons, and each of the neurons have thousands of connections with other neurons. So there are trillions and trillions and trillions of connections that are there in the brain. And we call those connections, we call them synapses, but it's where one nerve talks to another. And the way it talks to the next nerve along is at where the two meet, at what we call a synapse. The one nerve releases chemicals, we call them neurochemicals. So we've all heard of dopamine and serotonin and stuff like that. Well, it releases chemicals like that, and they interact with what are called receptors on the other side, and then that sends a signal down the next nerve. So anyway, on a cellular level, those connections are changing all the time, one way or the other. And it really comes down to a use it or lose it type of situation. The more you use them, usually, the more they're kind of upregulated. You get more receptors. You're allowed to have those neurotransmitters interact with the receptors more. You even change what genes are being turned on and turned off, depending on how you're using these individual neurons. So the more you kind of strengthen a neuronal channel, a neuronal network, the more you use it, the more likely it is to be more robust and strong, because the connections get better and better and faster. And you can even grow new connections there. And the opposite is true, though. And we've seen this in chronic stress and depression and things like that, where if various networks in the brain aren't being used as much because of stress and depletion and all that sort of thing, they will start to downgrade. There'll be less receptors. There'll be even less areas where the nerves can attach to one another. And so you can really kind of shrink away various connections and make them much weaker, just as easily as you can make ones very strong. And so this system is dynamic. It's going all the time, changing all the time. Not the big major networks, but where you are in the network and how strong it is or isn't. So I think and there's really good scientific evidence for all this. I mean, it's robust evidence. And so I think it's really fascinating when we get to our world of, trying to help people out navigating their lives.
And when there are different opinions about the reasons why people go into burnout, or even what causes Alzheimer's. I know that you've done work on a lot of patients with Alzheimer's, so you for sure have an observation on this disease for sure. What do you think is the major cause of, let's start with burnout. Is it because of people not using the right neurons, or is it what some people claim, nutritional deficiency, or maybe a certain toxicity? What have you observed to be the major cause of burnout?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could throw any of those in there. I think all of us live in very dynamic worlds with tons of stressors, and we're polluting ourselves all the time, and we're not eating right and all that sort of thing. And you touched upon Alzheimer's, but we certainly know that the health of our neurons, the health of our brain, very much depends on lots of good things, good nutrition, exercise, using it, thinking, challenging our brains, all that sort of thing is all important, even down in the Alzheimer realms. And so the same is going to go true for any sort of brain function, that it's multifactorial. With burnout, the causes are never just one thing, but in general, it's a situation where the system is being stressed kind of constantly, and we're not able to recharge it. We're not able to repair it as quickly as we might be able to. So I think the best analogy I've heard of late is kind of thinking about our brains as having a bank, if you will, of energy. We can call it psychic energy or emotional energy, whatever you want to call it, but it's that energy that gets us up out of bed, makes the coffee, gets to work, does our thing, takes care of the world, takes care of, daily activities, all that sort of thing. And we all have a certain bank, a certain account of that energy. But every day through our interactions with our environments or our interactions with ourselves sometimes, but one way or the other, we're either making deposits, if you will, into that bank. We're putting energy into it, charging it up. So you hear a great song driving into work that day, or a coworker thanks you for something you did. And it's a charge, it's an energy deposit. But we also experience all sorts of withdrawals. And I think any of us can rattle off 1,000 withdrawals that occur in our lives. Somebody says something nasty to us, somebody cuts us off on the freeway or whatever. But one way or the other, these withdrawals are being made all the time. So we're making deposits, we're making withdrawals on that energy. And we tend to think of burnout as when you reach a point where you're just badly overdrawn. You even when you do make deposits, it's not moving the needle much because you are so badly overdrawn. You just don't have any energy. So the energy for being able to just do the common basic daily things isn't there. And so for everybody, this is going to vary. What are your stressors? What are my stressors? What are going to make the biggest withdrawals and what are going to make the best deposits for us? And that's why I can't say, oh, yes, absolutely, this is what causes burnout, because it's going to be a milieu of things.
Yeah. With Alzheimer's, though, the part that you mentioned about how much you're using your brain seems to be a bit going against the logic, because I've observed cases, or I've heard of cases of friends of mine who've had relatives with Alzheimer's that were very active, that were actually the opposites, that had used their brain maybe too much. Maybe they've burned some of these neural connections. I don't know. Have you had any of these?
No, I would argue that we've got to be careful of anecdote too, right? In that eating well, staying active and learning, and exercising, they're all, if you look at thousands of people, statistically, they are protective against Alzheimer, but it's not one-to-one.
Mm-hmm.
So you could be a college professor reading ancient script every day and still get horrible Alzheimer's. It's not a vaccination against the disease, if you will. But over big populations, it certainly pans out that it is far better to stay intellectually active than not, and physically active as well.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to neuroscience now, what is your engagement with the University of Virginia Tech? Are you teaching neuroscience there? Are you doing some research?
Yeah, my research days are over. I retired from doing surgery a couple of years ago. And so now what I do is teach undergrads neuroscience, and I also teach medical students neuroscience, both at Virginia Tech. And we go into all sorts of things, but basically it's in the realm of what we call clinical, meaning diseases and how we treat the diseases and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Does it have to do with psychological impacts on neuroscience?
We do definitely get into that for a couple of reasons. One is I think it's a mistake to treat the physical ailments, if you will, of the brain differently from the psychological. I mean, it's all the same organ. It doesn't change the way it works for one or the other. And so I think it's really important to include both. And at Virginia Tech has a really robust neuroscience school. It's the Virginia Tech School of Neuroscience, and they have a big arm of behavioral science for sure, behavioral neuroscience for sure. But I am definitely more in the clinical realm, but we definitely touch on psychological illnesses. And then really for the last 15, 20 years, I've been deeply involved in the world of burnout. So we spent a fair amount of time talking about burnout and how to hopefully prevent it and how to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Let's go into the topic of burnout a little bit. We don't need to, go very deep, but you mentioned some of the causes of burnout. Let's talk about the way a person may realize themselves they have a burnout, because very often people don't know until they're unable to function. So what are some signs that you can catch yourself with?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm going to give you a little background in how I got involved in it. I got involved in it because I ran our neurosurgery department, and then I had 11 surgeons, a whole bunch of residents, 11 PAs, bunch of nurses and support staff. It was a fairly big department, and I think we were doing a good job taking care of patients. But we were getting complaints all the time about people on our team. And the complaints, again, they weren't professional in terms of, are you able to do good surgery, or are you making the right decisions for your patients? They were just being, and I say they, I think I'm included, but we were just being jerks. We were not nice. We were causing people to feel bad about themselves, and we were making people cry. And, we were always just snapping and barking and just really taking advantage of people and stuff just to get the job done, if you will. And it reached such a toxic point where I figured I had to do something to try to get us back on a good track. And I stumbled on the idea of, could this be burnout? Because if you look at the classic definitions of burnout, or you put everybody through a burnout assay, like the Maslach burnout assay, they might come out of it looking pretty good. And yet I would argue that the team was burnt out. And so the way I got involved was I started working on the burnout and happened to run into really a world expert on physician burnout. His name's Wayne Sotil, and he and I worked on the team for a couple of years. But the long and short of it is, by addressing it as burnout, there was such a transformation. It was almost miraculous to me. Before we started this, I was getting 30, 40, 50 formal complaints about our team a month, and having to deal with that. And within a few months of getting this going, at least it took a while, but after several months of working on this, the complaints dropped to zero. And all of a sudden, our team was getting awards all across the system and all for being so helpful and being wonderful and all this sort of thing. So this is a long answer to your very pointed question. And that is, I think it becomes very hard for people to recognize it in themselves. And it doesn't have to fit a classic pattern. The classic pattern is, it's difficult for you to get up and get moving. There's just no energy to do your daily things, and you lose your empathy and you become nihilistic and that sort of thing. Well, our guys weren't like that at all. They were still high energy. They were doing millions of operations and all that, but their personalities started to drag. So they were able to hold up their professional sides, but their personalities started to crash. Wow. And I think that, for this reason, and again, nobody was recognizing it in themselves, but if you start pushing them on various questions, like, what do you like at home? What are you doing when you get home? Are you interacting with your family? Are you doing fun things? Or are you just crashing in front of a TV and drinking or something? What we found is just all sorts of idiosyncrasies started coming out in our people. So yeah, I mean, we may be able to recognize it as an overall depletion in our energy and like I said, a nihilism and a lack of empathy, but that's hard to recognize in yourself. And sometimes you have to get other people to say, wait a minute, you're not the same person that, I've been with for the last several years. You just, you are either a blank slate, or you're nasty, or you're lost all your interest in everything that used to be interested in. I know myself, for example, I don't know if you can see in the room, but there's instruments in there, and I love playing guitar and banjo and that sort of thing. And I know when I'm depleted, I stop playing those things. It's actually a sign to me that, wait a minute, you better start working on yourself, because you are losing interest in things that, really generally,
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow, fantastic. I mean, fantastic explanation of the state of burnout. And so once you acknowledge this in your department, what were some of the steps that you took to address it within those few months?
Yeah, so well, to be honest with you, we kind of experimented with our team, and we eventually wrote it up into 3 books on the subject and all. But we cycled through, I don't know, it must have been 70 or 80 different types of exercises that we would have the team do for a week or two, and then they would bring us back feedback on, how it made them feel. Did they notice anything different, and that sort of thing. So I'm not going to rattle off 70 or 80 different techniques for you, but I'll give you a couple or a few of the ones that we think are really important. So to get back to your previous question, one of the first steps, I would argue, one of the first steps is to develop a sense of what we call it self-compassion, but it's really an emotional intelligence about yourself. And, so many of us in this hectic, wildly spinning world, we are so externally oriented. We got to get the job done. We got to get the kids taken care of. We got to do this. We got to do that. And we're constantly focused on external things. In medicine, it was really easy because you're always focused on the patient and their outcomes. And it's even to the point where you feel guilty if you give yourself, your own health, either mental or physical, even a minute's notice. But we would argue that that's one of the first things you need to do. Periodically, you need to sit down and take stock of, where am I? What am I at? How do I feel? And what's lifting me up? What's bringing me down? Are things going the way I would want them to? Am I the person that I would want to be for my family, for my workmates, all that sort of thing? And, write it down, think about it, give it some real thought. If you've got really close people who you trust, ask them too, get their input on where you're at. But it's awfully hard to address this if you don't understand it in yourself, just precisely your question. If you're not seeing it in yourself, how do you take care of it? So oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, and especially I have the feeling that sometimes it's a chronic burnout. It's not something that happens abruptly, like that you can notice, but it's something that's been taking years to show itself.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, because, it's just creeping its way in there, right? So
Yeah.
how are you going to notice it? And the other thing that we always tell people, it's not black and white, it's not binary. It's probably cycling like this all the time. But if it's cycling downwards, eventually it reaches that point, like I said, where you can't recharge it. Even if you do the things that are fun for you, even if you pick up the banjo, it's not working, So step number one, self-compassion. Really get to know yourself and where you're at and where you want to be, and set up positive goals for your life. These are the places I would like to be. What direction am I going? Am I getting closer or further away? That sort of thing. Step number two, which is part and parcel with it, is self-care. And that is, you're not going to fix it if you don't do something to fix it. It's not going to happen spontaneously. You're not going to take a pill and it's going to go away. You actually have to actively address it. And one of the hard things about it is because burnout involves energy depletion, you've got to invest some energy up front to get started.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't, and therefore it can be hard. It can be hard to take that first step to start making it better. So these are the two, fundamental principles you got to get started on: self-compassion, self-care. And we have an axiom that goes with that, and that is no guilt ever for self-compassion, self-care, because we tend to feel guilty when we do it. And then from there, you can get into all sorts of exercises. So I'll give you a couple quickies. I promise to be quicker on it. But one is what we call, I'm going to block on my formal terminology for it. But one is to overlook and discuss your stressors. And what do I mean by that? Because you got to be careful. What we don't want is to have, let's say something goes wrong with a coworker at work today, and you get home and you say, geez, had a bad day at work. And then you get into, he drank my coffee, then I said something about it, then he said this, then I said this, then he said this. Then all you're doing is reliving it.
Mm-hmm.
But what we want, debriefing your stressors is the word I was looking for. But anyway, what you can do periodically, if there are things that are really getting under your skin, if you have somebody trusted that you can discuss these things with, a coworker or a spouse, a friend, it's good every so often to say, hey, this thing happened today, and it really bothers me that it's still bothering me. It's bothering me that it's under my skin. I don't know why I can't let it go. So now what you're doing is you're talking about your response. You're not talking about all the nitty-gritty of the incident. You're talking about, well, how did I respond? Could I have responded better?
Mm-hmm.
Could I have responded in a more adaptive way? That would lead to a better relationship out there. And it's interesting. I'll give you one example. When we would do this with our team, somebody brought in the fact that when we dealt with abused children, they would get so angry at the parents. And they said, I just want to throttle the parents for harming the children. And the whole group was able to say, yeah, I mean, dealing with this, it's sad and tragic and awful thing, but what I'm feeling is anger and hostility. And how do I still be a good doctor and do everything I need to do when I'm in that mode? And it was a tremendous discussion. And you don't necessarily come up with blinding solutions, but just getting it out there, and it will take a lot of the power out of the negativity of it. So every so often, debriefing some bad stressors focused on your response rather than the nitty-gritty is a great thing to do. And then I would couple that, and there's an exercise that we should do regularly, all of us should do. And that we call harvesting our uplifts. And that is simply, at least again, we would go through our days and we actually train our brains to look for bad. That was my business. If an operation goes well, I don't sit there and high five. I think, okay, what can go wrong now? What's going to mess this operation up after it went so well in the operating room? If he gets infected, he gets a pulmonary embolus, he gets this, he gets that. It can turn everything to crap. And so my brain was always searching for the negative side of things, and you could bring that to home, very easy. So one of the things that we do is tell people, either with a piece of paper or with your about your days, write down 5 things a day that went well, that brought a smile on your face, that made you feel happier, that made you feel more connected. Just positive things that happened in your day and write them down. And when you get home that night, just before you go to bed, review them and remind yourself that good things are happening around you day to day. Well, going back to kind of the neuroscience side of all this we were talking about, at first you got to kind of force yourself to do this. You're not going to remember, you're not going to think about it. You just, okay, I gotta go five things. It's like a homework assignment. All right, I'll find those 5 things. But after a week or two, your brain starts getting trained and you start, all of a sudden, you're noticing these things spontaneously. Hey, that nurse just thanked me. Hey, I got a hug from this patient's family. And things that you would just blow through and not even notice, all of a sudden you're logging in. And therefore your days become more positive. You're making more deposits in that bank of energy of yours.
Do you think that the fact that these people all worked in a team and they were all given the same assignments, they were all dealing with the same problem simultaneously, do you think this helped in some way? Because, they had the support system also.
Yeah, what a wonderful question. This is hard to go it alone.
Yeah.
You can go it alone. You can do all these exercises we talked about, but you got to kind of almost have a make-believe friend. You're going to have to be able to get it out there, either journal it, you could journal it, or you could speak it to your computer. You could podcast it if you want. I don't know, but it's much better if you have an environment of trusted people that you can enter these discussions with. And we had some very strong ground rules about. We did these sessions really every week for a few years, but we had some ground rules that, for example, what we talked about in there stayed in there, and that there was no belittling of each other. So if somebody shares something that they find embarrassing, it's not going to help if you all make fun of the person, from that point on and all. What we found, originally, this was a group of high-end healthcare providers, who were very cynical, and they're like, and because I was a boss, at least I was able to say, you will come to these sessions. And so they had to, but they found every excuse not to at first. But like I said, it was miraculous. The reason why I'm kind of proselytize about it is that within, I don't know, 6 months, everybody made it. You didn't have to tell people to come. The room was packed with our team. And as you say, having that team, and we already depended on each other very much in the clinical sense, right? We had to trust each other in terms of, you're taking care of my patients, I'm taking care of yours. So I think that helped a lot. So we do feel that if, it's really good if you can establish what we would call a resilience group. You could be doing this with a spouse, a loved one, a partner, friends. Coworkers often are easy because, again, you have shared experiences, but they've got to buy into it eventually, right? Because it's going to be very much built on trust, and you're going to discuss your responses and how you reacted and what made you feel good and what made you feel bad, and that's not easy for people.
Yeah. Is there a way you are maybe packaging this methodology that you've applied for future uses by medical professionals? And the reason why I'm asking, Gary, is because I've actually spoken to relatives of surgeons and of other people that have participated in the small after-work groups of surgeons, and it usually these evenings end up with a lot of alcohol and them spilling up their sorrows of losing a patient or things like that. I mean, there needs to be an outlet for all of this. Although you mentioned you could be tough-skinned at times, and surgeons and doctors are known to be tough-skinned because they have to. You have to, kind of, you know best. You need to go through the day without becoming too empathic, but it still creeps in deep down inside. So you need an outlet for this more than probably other professions. Have you thought of, or maybe are you doing something like packaging of this methodology that you've already experienced to provide it to surgeon groups, medical doctors, other medical doctors?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thanks for the amazing questions. And they're such good questions, they make me ramble on. So you got to forgive me, when I keep talking away. But
everything was on point and very relevant.
Well, good. But for example, I just came out with a novel, and it's about a neurosurgeon who's clearly burnt out, and he begins to see ghosts. But we do touch in the book on a lot of things you just talked about the constant stress, the fact that they may look tough on the outside, but you're taking hits all the time. I'm going to give you one vignette on this. It's not out of the novel; it's out of my real life. But I I saw more tragedy and more awfulness than you can imagine. I mean, it was just every day, and every night on call, several horrible car accidents and gunshot wounds and all that sort of thing would be coming in. And, everybody's lives were being turned upside down. And I felt like I sailed right through it. It was very rare where I felt like it really hit. Because, I guess I was of the mindset that if I let it get in there, then how do I move on to the next one?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And when I stopped operating, one of the things I noticed is that I cry all the time. Now, I don't mean, because my toast fell on the floor, but if I'm watching a movie that has some, sentimentality to it, all of a sudden I feel tears streaming down my face. I'm like, what is this?
Yeah.
And I think what I'm saying is, I think that stuff was logging in all the time. You're just blocking it off. But to get back to your very pointed question, we wrote 3 books on this. So there are three books available. One is neurosurgery oriented, one is to physicians. So when we read the neurosurgery one, they said, well, it's not just neurosurgeons who burn out, as doctors. And so we wrote one oriented to doctors. And then people said, well, it's not just doctors in medicine who are burning out. So we wrote one oriented to all healthcare providers. And then people started saying, well, it's not just, people in healthcare burnout. We said, wait, that's enough. We've gone as far as we can take it with our expertise. So we do have books. I was doing a lot of talks, and then COVID hit, and it's kind of been slow since, just going out and giving talks. So I've been doing it more locally than anything. And of course, we do it in our national meetings and stuff like that. I thought of doing my own podcast, but I think it's too hard work. Much kudos to you for being able to sustain it. But I started making little 3-minute chops that I started putting on TikTok, and I'm going to keep doing that in the resilience field and stuff like that. So yeah, we're trying to get the message out through multiple ways.
Mm-hmm. But is there like a packaged system apart from what is already in the books that is split in 3 parts, like a system of how to deal with burnout in a medical setting?
Not of my doing. And I think it's a good question. I don't think, like in the United States, it is definitely being recognized. Unfortunately, there's a lot of, as we talked about, cynicism. And so even though systems recognize it, they'll give a lecture, or they'll bring a bunch of puppies in for people to pet, once a year, and they'll say, okay, we're doing what we need to fight burnout. I remember in one of your YouTube videos, you were talking about the need for consistency of message and consistency of effort. And I would say this very much goes for burnout, particularly in those early days of trying to tackle it. It would be that, it's good to be doing positive oriented exercises daily. And we go right back down to the neuroscience. We need to start grooving the neural networks in our brain that normally are tied into our reward centers and all that are saying, here, this is good for you. This is making you happy. This is giving you energy. And but if you just go see a lecture, it's not going to do that. You've got to kind of work on whatever works for you on a daily basis.
Yeah. Where can people find you? What's your TikTok? I think I checked it, but I forgot the name. It was very interesting, the shorts that you're making. What is the TikTok handle?
Oh, geez. It must be my name, Gary. Gary R. Simmons, usually.
Let me check.
The best thing
Yes,
to do is to,
Gary Simonds.
yeah, or to go just to my website. My website has all the links. So my website is my name, GaryRSimons.com. It's real easy.
And people can find your books there as well?
Yeah, the books are easy to trace that way, and links to where they're sold. And they're all sold on, the typical outlets of Amazon and Barnes and Noble and independent bookseller, all that sort of thing.
Tell us a bit about the books. We didn't touch on that at all. What are the books about? I mean, the first three are more professional. What is the fiction one about?
Yeah, and by the way, um, even with the nonfiction books, we tried to make them very readable and very short clips. One of the critiques, frankly, was that we made it kind of oversimplified. And our response to that is, if we made it super complicated, full of a bunch of psychological jargon and stuff, we were afraid that people would just turn it off. So it's all very practical. Here's something you could try. Here's a question for you to think about. Here's something you can discuss with, a group or a partner or whatever. So and like the middle book, it's called The Thriving Physician. What we did there is we went through, I don't know, 60, 70 typical stressors that a physician might face. And then the rest of the chapter is, well, how might you deal with this stressor? What might turn it into a growth experience rather than, a destructive experience. So then the novel, I always wanted to write a book about what modern neurosurgery really is like, what that world is like. Because it's a foreign world to most people, and it's pretty heart-rending. But and so originally, I was going to write this eyes wide open account of it, and I thought, it's just going to sound like another textbook. So I wondered if I could create a novel centered around that world, where I was hoping, really to put the reader right into the operating room, have the brain bleeding on them, and them trying to figure out what the heck they're going to do. And so I came up with this idea of a neurosurgeon who's overworked, really a workaholic, clearly is burned out, but doing his job and doing it well, who then begins to see things that aren't there. And at first he thinks they're hallucinations, but then he convinces himself that they're ghosts. And his professional world and his home life start to come apart as he sees more and more of these ghosts. And hopefully the readers will question, is he losing his mind, or are the ghosts real, and what's going on here, and where will it end? So that's what it's about. And hopefully
Okay.
it's done well. I mean, it's getting good reviews and people seem to enjoy it. So and I really want the other thing I really wanted was I was hoping people would want to discuss it, read it, and say, "Hey, Simmons, why in the world did you do this?" Or what were you going after with this and all.
This one is called Death's Pale Flag.
It is called Death's Pale Flag,
Yeah.
which is a quote from Romeo and Juliet.
Gary, I truly enjoyed this conversation, for real. Thank you so much for everything that you shared, for all the tips for burnout, for describing so realistically the life and the environment in which a brain surgeon works. And that was, I think you managed to immerse everyone now in in the environment, and to let us feel with you what it was like. Thank you so much for all of that.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a true pleasure.